So too often we look at suffering as the bane to our happiness and our successes. But what if we stop doing that? What if we don't do that and actually reframe our suffering in a different way? How about we do that? Hey, don't stop watching the video. Stick around. We'll get after it, and I think you'll enjoy the discussion. So stick around.
Hey there, guys. So welcome back. Yeah, look, how about looking at suffering as a catalyst for change? And I started by saying we often see it as the bane to our success and happiness. And I often say that the true currency of our lives is our happiness. So it's important. But just bear with me. And on the path to my growth that I've been sharing with you since I started this, I study the Stoics and the philosophers for the philosophical insights on the questions that I ask. And then I turn to people like Massimo Pigliucci to analyze the Stoics and the philosophers for me in a more educated way, more so than I can on my own. And then, in addition to the Stoics and the philosophers, I turn to people like Andrew Huberman and Arthur Brooks for the scientific side of my growth. And in doing that, or I should say, why I pursued it that way is because basically I rewrote my life's mission statement, and I thought I can use YouTube to share past experiences, uh, observations, and with a master's in liberal studies, where the focus was on social and behavioral sciences, take that experience and the folks I just talked about and try to just make people just a little happier and a little bit more focused on their purpose, whatever that is. And I started that journey by first, obviously, you have to start with the man in the mirror. So I started with me, the change with me. And throughout that change, so far, two books. And I think this YouTube channel will eventually garner more observations, or what they like to call views, because I think our material is worthwhile. But anyway, I digress. But I just wanted to mention that a few people on my path that I follow and look to for clarity in some of the questions that I ask myself. But I mean, back to suffering. I'm not sure if you've ever heard the term amor fati, and it is Latin for basically embracing our suffering. It generally pretty much means the love of fate. And what it is asking the question, if we're happy and content when things are going well and we embrace that, what is the harm in embracing when they're not? And again, you will say, Warren, that's easier said than done. In the case of, let's say, the loss of a job or the loss of a child or the loss of a loved one, any loss, right, is loss. And each person deals with that differently, but you'll say, are you telling me to embrace this? And indeed, the answer is yes. What I'm not saying is not to be sad and to mourn. What I am saying, though, and what the Stoics have armed us with, is that after we mourn and after we cry and after we're sorrowful, we have to embrace it as a catalyst. And I give you an example. Instead of seeing death as something to fear because of the loss of someone, it could incite us to live more healthily, let's say, especially if that person sadly passed from pre-existing medical conditions. You could take that and look at it and say, okay, runs in my family. Here are some things that I can do to offset passing early. Let's say that runs in your family where people die young. Just things like that, to take the moment after mourning and being sorrowful to look at the loss as a catalyst. And again, I'm not saying it's easy to do. I'm saying it is doable and can be done. We just have to be willing to reframe it. And it's not that easy. It really isn't that easy, because some people often, it seems, when it rains, it pours. And when one person down the street is having what they think is their worst dumpster fire day, there's maybe several. I'm sure it's more than several when you look at it in the grand scheme of things and universal. There's so many more people having worst dumpster fire days than we are. But it's not easy. It's not easy. And sometimes when it rains, it pours. So I get it. But it takes practice. And that brings me to one of the first ways of reframing. And that is simply, number one, is reframing the suffering. Rather than viewing suffering as a burden, consider it as an opportunity to gain strength, resilience, and wisdom. And I want you to think about that one as we continue, because I'm going to come back to it. And I mentioned Arthur Brooks earlier, and you're going to hear more from him in a little while, and I'll expand on it. But yeah, if we reframe it to gain strength, like I alluded to, resilience and wisdom, then it's not as painful, right? And I gave an example of that one already. And then number two is learn from mistakes. Reflect on past hardships and identify lessons learned, focusing on personal growth and avoiding self-blame. And I talked about Arthur Brooks, and I want you to consider this, and then we'll talk about it on the other side. He was actually on Rich Roll's podcast talking about what really makes us happy. And he mentioned an experiment that he runs with his kids. So I'll let him tell you about it, and we'll talk on the other side.
I ask my students in my class, in my happiness class, to keep a failure and disappointment list. Ever talked to you about this before?
I can't remember, maybe.
Yeah, so they keep a little notebook. And each time something bad happens that feels like a loss, or it feels like a disappointment, or feels like a failure, which is a lot. I mean, this happens to us pretty frequently. You write it down and leave 2 lines blank. And on the first line, you write down, it's like, that thing really bothered me. It really bothered me. And then a month later, you come back to the first line that you left blank under it and write down, what did you learn? What did you learn about that? What did you learn from that experience? And then 3 months later, you come back to the second line and write down a good thing that happened because of that loss. And you're filling in the notebook. And by the time you're going to a new thing that's really bugging you, really bothering you, you start to look forward to it because you're going to be looking back at the knowledge and growth from past negative experiences and the benefit that actually has come from those negative experiences. Well, never waste sacrifice. Never waste your suffering.
So, like I said, we'll talk a little bit more. That will be. I took that and I refined it a little bit for our purposes. So we'll talk about that a little bit further at the end. But the third thing is to share experiences, share our stories, and sharing our experiences can inspire and support others facing similar challenges. And imagine this. I've shared this story before about sharing experiences because it's tough, right? It's tough being vulnerable, and it's tough being that person in the arena, right? Not knowing if you're facing another lion or another gladiator. It is pretty lonely standing in the middle, being looked at, expected to act. I've often shared the story that I don't have a very good relationship with my boys, elderly men, but we don't. And we continue to work on it. I say we because that's in the hopes that they are working through whatever it is. And I'm doing the same. So, but we don't. And I've shared that before. And that's not easy to do in this forum, in any forum really. But the whole point is to share our stories with trusted people, and you can find out if you can trust someone by simply doing that, right? Providing them with information to see how they will deal and handle that information, if that information will be weaponized against you or towards you. But you can trust people by providing them with enough information that you want to share, not everything, but what you want to share with them, and then see what happens. So there's the whole vulnerability piece, but sharing our experiences, this forum and others like it, will help others that are going through similar experiences, I think. And then there's develop empathy. Experiencing suffering can enhance empathy, enabling us to better understand and support others in their struggles. And I'll share a personal example on this one. I actually did an episode on it, and it was about a soldier of mine that after a deployment came back and was addicted to a whole host of things. And the behavior that came with the addiction was hard to deal with. It was hard to deal with. And being in the Army, which is a zero tolerance for substance abuse or use, we at first, I will admit, thought of all the why just make it, push the easy button and get her out so we can move on to other soldiers that are doing what they need to do and are asked to do and save the time. So it was easy. And at first the thoughts at least passed through my head initially. And again, vulnerability, because I so regret having to say that, but I did. Anyway, I didn't follow through with that, and neither did anyone else around her. And despite knowing the outcome, that at this point the behavior after rehab, if she took well to the rehab. And again, you can check out the episode up there if you like after this one. But if she took to the rehab, we were hoping that things would work out for her. And like I said, the initial thoughts went away pretty quickly. And then we started to empathize because we knew, like I said, what the inevitability was. Again, even if she took well to the rehab, her career was pretty much over. Her military career was pretty much over. And it's not because of that we started to empathize, but we started to see the human condition in a completely different way through the eyes of someone else, someone close to you. And in terms of emotional intelligence and being more empathetic, that lesson in and of itself taught me a whole lot more so than others that I've experienced. But just developing empathy and enhancing it is part of how we can reframe suffering, I think. And then there is foster resiliency or foster resilience. Cultivate resilience and overcome adversity by setting achievable goals and practicing self-care. And this one, though achievable, rubs people wrong. And because they focus on the self-care piece of it and think that self-care equates to being selfish. And it's so far from the truth, because self-care is being, oh, by the way, folks, if you're still watching at this point, you know it. You're rock stars. Thanks for sticking around. Thanks for sticking around and stopping by. But some people think that self-care is selfish, and it's so far from that. It's actually responsible behavior, and it is warranted and necessary to keep a balance, to keep our sanity, to tone down on the suffering. And that's another thing with suffering, is that we always equate suffering with the big ticket items that happens in our lives. And suffering, like I alluded to it earlier, that it is the small things too, the small things. But self-care helps with those clarity moments, with toning down the voices in our heads, to just give us a moment of clarity and peace, not having to suffer through the voices and the noise that is life, and based on what we surround ourselves and who we surround ourselves with can become really loud. So there's that. We need to make sure that we tailor our circles to suit what it is we want to intake and be a part of and do and be known for. So yeah, self-care sometimes get a lot of pushback because people confuse it with selfish, but it's not. It's not. And then you heard Arthur Brooks's experiment that he has with his kids. I just wanted to change just the two things. Instead of coming back a month later and then 3 months later, because our lives go on and we're no longer students, not all of us anyway, or not in that traditional sense. If we are, we don't have the time, the luxury of time to do it in such long periods. So I just say, instead of a month and 3 months, how about you do it as the events occur? And you go through the process and you reevaluate the process. And by reevaluating the process, hopefully it gets you to grow, because you're revisiting these things that are your triggers, and it should help you to grow. And now your suffering doesn't become suffering. It actually becomes really helpful, because you can tailor it to future experiences, because you know some of those things are going to resurface. It's life. Some of those things are going to come around again. They might come around differently, but they will come around again. So you're just, by going through the process, you're tailoring your muscle memory, your prefrontal cortex, to engage itself and be ready for the next time. Not that you're wishing for next times, but you know, we live in the real world, and life gets a vote. So just wanted to share that with you and talk about it, and hope you got something out of it. So I would really like to hear your comments on my take, and actually Arthur Brooks's take at looking at suffering. And I hope it helps somebody. So chin ups out there. Don't be so hard on yourselves. Life happens and we can live it, or we can watch it go by. All right. I say we do the first one and live it. All right.
So, hey guys, I think I want to leave it there for today. Hope you got something out of it. And hey, look, it's tough out there. We know that. We knew that going in. So if we just practice these tips on how to handle our suffering, maybe we won't suffer so badly when we do. All right. And until our next conversation, be good out there. Be good out there. Take care of yourselves. And we'll talk again soon.